Good day and welcome to this first and important lesson in the 10-day chess challenge. I'm excited to present this challenge to you because I know you can improve a lot by doing it. The reason I'm so confident that you will improve is because we are going to focus on the two most important thinking methods. And if you master these two thinking methods, then you will be able to find good moves in almost any position. So what are these two methods? Firstly, it's your calculation method, and secondly, your evaluation method. In this video, I'm going to focus on the calculation process. I'm first going to give you an overview of how the calculation method works, and then I'm going to give you some examples that will help you understand exactly how it works. Okay, so first the overview. The first step in the calculation process is to identify your opponent's threats. They say the first principle in war is that you must know your enemy. And in calculation, it's important to know what your opponent is threatening before you start calculating your own moves. So that's the first step. You must know your opponent's threats. The second step is to identify all the targets and tactical motives in the position. Now, a target is a piece or a pawn that you are attacking or that you can easily attack. A motive is a known way to exploit that target or even to create a new target. But I'll discuss that in more detail later. The third step is to calculate all the checks. Now, the reason why we want to calculate all the checks first of all is because it's relatively easy to calculate a check. When you check your opponent, you know they have to do something to get out of check. So it's relatively straightforward. We want to calculate all the easy moves and see if there's maybe something in that. And if there isn't, then later we can start calculating moves that are a bit harder to calculate. Okay, so if there's nothing in the checks, then we move on to the fourth step, which is calculating all the captures. Now, captures are also relatively easy to calculate because when you capture an opponent's piece, then he's probably going to capture you back. So there aren't too many other moves that you have to consider. The fifth step is to calculate tempo moves. A tempo move is a move that makes a serious threat. So for example, if I make a move that threatens to checkmate you, then that would be a tempo move. And tempo moves are powerful because it gives me a chance to make a move, and also I know you can't do anything else than trying to find a defense against the move I just made. So that was the fifth step. Okay. I just gave you a quick overview of the calculation process, but the best way to understand it is to see it in action. So I'm going to use a few examples to show you how it works. Let's start with this one. In this position, it's white's turn to move. Now, before you start a puzzle, I always recommend you just do a quick comparison of the material, just to get an idea of what's going on. So we see white has a queen, black has a queen. White has two rooks, black has two rooks. White has 4 pawns, black has 5 pawns. Okay, so black has an extra pawn. He's a pawn ahead. It's nothing serious, but we have to keep in mind in this position black is a pawn ahead. Okay, so let's go to our first step of the calculation process, which is to identify our opponent's threats. Now, identifying your opponent's threats is essentially the calculation process from your opponent's point of view. So you want to see where can my opponent check me, where can he capture me, where can he threaten me. Okay, and in this position, black doesn't have any serious threats. Yes, he can capture our rook, but then we can just capture him. So we've done the first step. We've identified that our opponent doesn't have any serious threats against us. So now we can go on to the second step, which is identifying possible targets and tactical motives. Okay, so the obvious target in this position is the rook because we're already attacking it. And the other obvious target is the black king. Now, there aren't any other obvious targets at the moment, so let's start looking at the motives. Okay, if we played queen to h4 check, here's a possible motive that I notice of checking the king and at the same time putting pressure on that rook on e7. So I'm going to add the rook as a possible target. We can't capture the rook right away. It is being protected by the queen. But since we can possibly attack that rook, we want to include him as a target. So let's follow our process. The next step is to calculate all the checks. This check move, what if black just blocks the check? It seems like we didn't achieve anything. So that check move doesn't make much sense. Similarly, this check move also doesn't make much sense because black just blocks the check and it doesn't seem like we achieved anything. Okay. So next we look at the captures. Pretty much the only capture in this position that makes any sense is rook takes rook. And we can see that our opponent is forced to recapture us, else he loses material. So he has to capture us. And now this motive suddenly makes sense. Now you can see the king is being checked and this rook that's undefended now is going to fall. And we win the rook. Okay, so that is one example of how we managed to find a tactic by using this calculation process. Now I just want to tell you at this point, the most important thing is that you actually practice this thinking method. It won't always help you find tactics. And in many positions there aren't any tactics to find. But by practicing this thinking method and by using it in your games, it is a very effective and a very efficient way of helping you find tactics. And if you do it, you will find a lot more tactics in your games than what you previously did. Okay, but that said, the important thing that I want to mention here is that you have to practice thinking in this way. Remember, it's a calculation method. Alright, so let's look at another example. Okay, in this position it's white's turn to move. So let's quickly compare the material. White has a queen, black has a queen. White has 2 rooks, black has 2 rooks. White has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pawns. Black has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pawns. So from a material point of view, everything is equal in this position. Right, first step, we have to identify our opponent's threats. Where can he capture us? Where can he check us? Where can he threaten us? Okay, so first of all, we have to look at this move. Queen takes rook check. If we take his queen, then he takes, let's just do that. Okay, so it's actually white's turn to move here, so I can't do it now, but let's visualize that. Queen takes rook check. Rook takes queen. Rook takes queen check. And then we can move the king. Okay, so it's not a serious threat, but we have to keep in mind that if black wants to, he can exchange his queen for the 2 white rooks. Maybe this threat is more serious. Black is threatening to capture a pawn. Okay, it's not as serious as a checkmate or winning one of our pieces, but we don't want to lose a pawn unnecessarily, so we have to keep that in mind as a threat that black has against us. Okay, so let's start the calculation process. We've already identified that our opponent doesn't have any serious threats against us, so now we're going to find the targets. Obviously that rook is a target because he's already being attacked. And the king is also a target because we can easily check him. This rook is not really a target because we can't attack or exploit him at the moment. The only way to attack the queen is maybe to play the pawn up and then he just eats our pawn, so the queen is not a target at the moment either. Okay, so let's move on to the third step, calculating all the checks. There seems to be only one way to check the black king, and that is rook to d6. And if he simply moves out of check, what did we achieve? Doesn't seem like we achieved anything, so the check move doesn't work. Okay, how about the captures? If rook captures, then he just captures us back, which also doesn't give us much. Alright, now when the obvious checks and the obvious captures doesn't work, then you have to think a bit about motives. Now remember, I said motives are known ways to exploit a target or to create a new target. Now in this position we notice the possible motive of queen to h4, which puts a lot of pressure on this rook now because the rook is pinned to the king. And as a matter of fact, it's also the solution move, because black is now forced to try and find a defense against our threat of simply capturing his rook. Now, if black tries to hang on with a move like queen to b4, then we can use another tactical motive here, which is attacking a defender. See, we play the simple move a3, now we're attacking this defender. So the queen wants to stay on this diagonal because she wants to protect the rook, but she can't. The pawn, and the rook is going to capture. So she's forced to move off that diagonal, for example, capturing the pawn, and now we win the rook. Okay, so that's how we used the calculation process to solve that one. I'm going to do one more example. Okay, so in this position it's white's turn to move, and on purpose I took a position with a lot of pieces that seem to be a little complicated. Okay, so this is going to be a good example to demonstrate the calculation process. First of all, first step is to quickly do a material comparison, and we see that material in this position is equal. Okay, so we can start the calculation process. First step is to identify our opponent's threats. Okay, from Black's point of view, there doesn't seem to be any checks or any captures or any moves that make serious threats against us. So we can have the liberty to move on to the next step, which is to identify all the targets and all the tactical motives. Right now, the first and obvious target must be the knight, because we're already threatening the knight, and also the only piece that protects the knight is the queen. That means if we can attack the queen, so the queen is going to be a target, we're going to maybe see if there's a way to attack the queen. Okay, I don't see any other immediate targets in this position. Maybe that knight is a target because we can push up the pawn, but that doesn't work. Black is just going to capture our pawn, so I don't see any other ways to attack this knight at the moment. So for the time being, I'm not going to regard this knight as a target. I'm going to focus on these two. Okay, so the next thing is to identify motives. And the first motive is to see that this rook is on the same file as the black queen. So that means if we can get rid of these three pieces here, then our rook will discover an attack on the black queen. Maybe it won't happen, but it's something we have to keep in mind. It's a possible motive. Another motive that we can notice here is if we attack the queen, and if we can get the knight to e7, we will be creating a fork between the king and the c6 square. Okay, so that's just a few motives to keep in mind. Right, let's go on to the next step, which is to calculate all the checks. There aren't any ways to check the black king here, so we move on to the fourth step, which is to calculate all the captures. Okay, this seems to be the only capture that's worth considering. But black is just going to recapture us, and what did we achieve then? Then we just helped black queen come out. So I don't see much point in that exchange. You don't want to help your opponent. Alright, there aren't any other captures, so now we have to look at tempo moves. Moves that threaten our opponent. And the first move that comes to mind is knight to d5. And what's nice about this move is if black captures you, then you recapture with this pawn, and suddenly this motive comes into play. You see, because now this knight is pinned due to the rook that can capture the queen. So we're going to win that knight on the next move. So black can't capture our knight. And since he can't capture our knight, it means he has to move his queen. Yet the queen has to move to a square where she keeps protecting the knight, else we're going to win the knight. So she'll go either here or here. Let's say, for example, she goes there. Okay, and now we again calculate all the checks. There aren't any checks. Captures. If we capture this knight, the black queen can't recapture us. Or if she does, then this motive comes into play. Knight takes e7 check, and after black gets out of check, we win the queen. Okay, so that was an example of how powerful this calculation method is. I want to remind you that it takes some practice. And also, the examples that I used here all worked out perfectly. I chose tactics that work out perfectly. But remember that in real games, the tactics don't always work out perfectly. So you have to be careful and you have to calculate carefully. Yet the main thing is, if you practice this thinking method, you will find a lot of tactics in your games. And you will also have a lot of more confidence in calculating moves and making sure whether it works for you or whether it doesn't. Okay, now in the following videos, I'm also going to be giving you some exercises that you can do to help you practice this thinking process. And if you are serious about improving, you should also be serious about doing those exercises as well as you possibly can. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this video. I'll see you next in the exercises.